Isaac Drummond was 39 years old the morning his wife of 9 years walked into a Philadelphia courtroom smiling, carrying a legal strategy that had been built on a fundamental miscalculation about who he was. He drove a 2014 Honda Accord with 94,000 miles on it. He brought his own lunch to the office every day in a black insulated bag and ate at his desk. He wore the same 3 pairs of work shoes in rotation because he had decided at 32 that comfort was the only reasonable criterion for footwear and had not revisited the question since. Sandra's friends from her corporate world called him Steady Isaac, said it with the particular warmth people reserve for men they consider harmless. And he had never corrected them, because the gap between what people assumed and what was true had served him well enough that disrupting it seemed like unnecessary effort. What Sandra had told her attorney was that her husband was a development consultant with a modest income, a shared apartment, and a minority interest in a local business partnership she described as mostly administrative. What the partnership's publicly available filings with the Pennsylvania Secretary of State showed was $14 million in active community development projects across 6 Philadelphia neighborhoods and 15 years of compounding equity that nobody in Sandra's circle had ever thought to look up. What her attorney had not done, not once in 8 months, of preparing his case, was check the name on the judicial assignment notice against the names on those filings. She walked into that courtroom, smiling. The smile was gone before she found her seat. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The Drummond Reese office sat on the 2nd floor of a converted row house on Germantown Avenue, and at 6 in the morning, it was exactly the kind of quiet Isaac preferred for the work that required his full attention. The conference room held a mahogany table he had found at a salvage auction in 2008. A solid piece that someone had abused, the surface darkened and pocked, the joints loose on one end. He had spent 3 consecutive weekends stripping it, re-gluing the joints, finishing it with a dark oil that brought out the grain, the way good oil brought out wood that had something worth showing. It was the first substantial thing he had refinished himself, and it had sat in every office Drummond Reese had ever occupied, because he was not a man who discarded things that held. Every significant decision the company had made in 15 years had been made at that table. He sat at it now in the early morning with a project proposal spread in front of him. The Henderson Street development. 48 units of historic rehabilitation in North Philadelphia. The largest project Drummond Reese had ever taken on. He had been reviewing the Phase 1 contractor submission since 5:30. He was a man who read everything twice and signed nothing he had not read twice, which had been Bernard's observation about him in the early years and remained accurate. His mother, Claudine Drummond, had been a school teacher in West Philadelphia for 32 years. She had died 3 years ago, quietly, the way she had done most things, in the house on Haverford Avenue where Isaac had grown up. He still heard her voice in the specific silence of early mornings, which was when she had done her own best thinking. She used to tell him, when he was 23 and trying to convince Bernard Reese that 2 young men with one good idea between them could actually build something lasting in a city that had seen many good ideas fail. Isaac, a man's name opens doors before he does. Build the name right. He had taken that as the first operating principle of the company and had not revised it since. Drummond Reese Community Development Partners had been incorporated 15 years ago with 2 co-founders, equal shares, equal signatures, and the kind of early period difficulty that either ended companies or defined them. It had defined them. Bernard Reese had left the day-to-day operation 8 years ago when his appointment to the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas had required it. His equity stake remained, held in a recusal-compliant structure his ethics council had established on appointment. Isaac had run the operational side alone since then. The company had grown in every year of his sole management. A framed co-founder certificate hung on the wall of Isaac's private office. Black frame, clean white mat. Their two signatures at the bottom of a document establishing Drummond Reese Community Development Partners, LLC, dated 15 years prior. It had hung in every office he had ever used, and would hang in the next one. Sandra had asked about it once, early in their marriage, and he had explained who Bernard was, and what the company was, and what the certificate meant. She had nodded and moved to the next room, and had not asked about it again. He had met Sandra Marsh at a community fundraiser for a West Philadelphia Recreation Center renovation 11 years ago. She was in healthcare administration, precise, purposeful, with the kind of focused attention that made you feel, when she was directing it at you, that you were the most important variable in whatever she was calculating. He had liked that about her immediately. He had always been drawn to people who took things seriously. They married 2 years later, in a ceremony at a venue in Fairmount Park that she had organized with the same precision she brought to everything. The marriage had run warm and parallel for the first 5 years. Parallel in the sense that two people can share a life without fully sharing a view of it, moving in the same direction at slightly different angles, the divergence only becoming visible at distance. She had grown more interested in the social architecture of Center City life. She had started keeping company with people whose primary professional activity was the performance of professional activity. She attended events where the question of what you did for a living carried more weight than the answer. She came home later. She stopped asking about the Henderson project, or the Germantown renovation, or the contractor meetings that defined the rhythm of Isaac's weeks. She had been asking about those things less and less for 2 years before she stopped entirely, and he had noted the stopping, without making it into a conversation. Isaac had continued arriving at the Germantown Avenue office at 6 in the morning and leaving when the work was done. He noticed the first transfer on a Tuesday morning in November, while pulling the joint account statements for their annual tax review. $4,800. The previous month. And the month before that, and the 8 months before that, the same amount, the same date range, moving to an account number he did not recognize. He did not call Sandra. He printed the statements. $43,200 transferred over 9 months to an account in a name he had not yet identified. In amounts timed to avoid automatic review flags. He had spent enough years reviewing development budgets to recognize a transfer pattern that had been designed to move below the line of casual attention. The work always builds the record. His mother's voice, quiet and unhurried. He sat at the mahogany table for a long time. Then he pulled up the court notice that had arrived that morning in Margaret Holloway's preliminary communication. Sandra had filed for divorce on Monday, and the case had been assigned, and the court date had been set for 6 weeks out. He read the full filing. Sandra's attorney, a man named Victor Lowe, 12 years in family law, a particular specialty in asset recapture cases, had attached a preliminary motion to reclassify Isaac's Drummond Reese partnership equity as a marital asset subject to equitable distribution. The motion included an informal valuation prepared by a Center City real estate broker named Philip Hartwick. Hartwick had placed the equity value at $380,000. He had arrived at that number using the company's visible physical assets and a surface revenue assessment. He had not looked at the Secretary of State filings. He had not reviewed the partnership's registered asset portfolio, the independent equity certification Margaret had commissioned 2 years prior, or any of the documentation that accurately described what 15 years of compounding development equity in a city with rising property values actually produced. Isaac looked at the number for a long moment. His hands did not shake. He looked at the judicial assignment section of the notice. Presiding, the Honorable Bernard J. Reese, Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas. He set the paper down. He sat with that information in the specific silence of a man who is not surprised, but is taking careful note of the exact shape of what is in front of him. He moved with the same deliberate calm that had defined every decision he had made in 15 years of building things that were meant to hold. He forwarded the full court filing to a secure folder. He photographed the transfer records. He pulled the company's complete registered filing history from the Secretary of State database and assembled it into a single document. He opened his laptop and built a timeline. 9 months of transfers, 11 months of Sandra's stated schedule cross-referenced against the credit card records where Hartwick's name appeared 4 times at restaurants she had attributed to work dinners. 3 hotel charges on their shared card she had described as a wellness retreat. He forwarded the timeline to his personal archive. Then he called Bernard Reese. Bernard answered on the second ring. He had already seen the case file. He said, "Isaac, I have to recuse. You know I have to recuse. I know. I'll do it at the top of the first hearing. The recusal notice goes into the record. I have to state the nature of the relationship and the company's registration status." A pause. You understand what that means when it's read into open court. Isaac understood exactly what that meant. "Do what the ethics require," he said. He hung up and called Margaret Holloway. Margaret Holloway had been practicing family and business law in Philadelphia for 28 years, and her office on Walnut Street had the particular organized density of a practice that handled complicated things, and handled them well. She had reviewed the court filing before Isaac arrived, and she set her reading glasses down the moment he finished speaking. "Victor Lowe is good," she said. "He is not good enough for what is about to happen to his case." She opened her copy of the preliminary motion and turned to the valuation exhibit. She read Hartwick's number. She set it down the way you set something down when you have found it to be genuinely surprising in its inaccuracy. "He got that number from Hartwick," Isaac said. "I see that. Philip Hartwick has been in the Center City brokerage market for 3 years. His transaction volume is modest. He did not pull the Secretary of State filings." Margaret folded her hands on the desk. "His valuation of your equity is wrong by approximately a factor of 7. She let that settle. "The recusal notice will be read into the open court record," she continued. "Judge Reese will be required to name the partnership, describe the relationship, and reference the company's registered status. Victor Lowe will hear, on the court record, in front of his client, the actual scope of what he spent 8 months misrepresenting. Every argument he has prepared, every motion he has filed, every number in his exhibit package. It was built on $380,000. She paused. "The registered equity position is $2.7 million. She picked up her pen. "We will be very prepared for the second hearing." He drove to North Philadelphia that afternoon, to his uncle's house on Broad Street. James Drummond, 67, retired civil engineer, a man who had spent 40 years understanding the load capacity of things that were meant to carry weight. James had a back porch that looked out over a garden he kept, with the same methodical attention he had brought to every professional calculation of his life. They sat with coffee, and James listened without interrupting. When Isaac finished, James was quiet for a long moment. "Did she know what you built?" he said. "She knew I was in development work." "That's different from knowing." He turned his mug in his hands. "A foundation doesn't announce itself," James said. "It just holds. The whole time she was standing on it, it was holding. She just never looked down." By the following week, Margaret's associate had assembled the background review on Philip Hartwick and Victor Lowe that confirmed what the preliminary picture had suggested. Hartwick was a licensed broker with a modest Center City transaction history and a professional presentation calibrated for clients who did not read the fine print. He had provided the equity valuation to Lowe in an informal consulting capacity, not a registered appraisal. No documented methodology, no reference to the Secretary of State filings, no certification. It was a number arrived at by a man who had looked at the surface of a company and described the whole thing. Victor Lowe had built an 8-month case on that number. He had also, as Margaret discovered through the court record search, lost 2 prior asset misclassification motions in the past 4 years, both in cases where the opposing counsel had simply arrived better prepared. Margaret filed Isaac's asset disclosure response with the court, attaching the registered partnership filings, the independent equity certification, and the complete 15-year documentation of Drummond Reese Community Development Partners' operating history. The response was 61 pages. It was organized in the way that documents prepared by people who had been keeping records for 15 years were organized, comprehensively, sequentially, and without gaps. On the Thursday before the hearing, Isaac drove home from the office at his usual time, cooked dinner, and set 2 plates on the table. Sandra came in at 7:30. She talked about her week. He asked one question and listened to the answer. She mentioned the upcoming court date in the tone of someone managing a project that was nearly complete. He nodded. He passed the salt. He asked about her sister in Wilmington. She said her sister was fine. The conversation moved through its expected sequence, and he participated in all of it with the attentiveness that had always been natural to him and that she had apparently long since stopped reading correctly. After dinner, he washed the dishes and went to his office for an hour. He sat at his desk. The co-founder certificate was on the wall in its black frame. 15 years old, their 2 signatures at the bottom. A document that had been on this wall for every year of his marriage to this woman. She had walked past it hundreds of times. 9 years and she had never asked. Some things could only be measured from the outside, and only after you had walked far enough away to see the whole wall. The Philadelphia family court on Vine Street occupied the 4th and 5th floors of a gray stone building that had processed the structural adjustments of thousands of lives, and on the Tuesday morning of the hearing, it was doing what it always did, moving quietly and without drama through the work of the day. Sandra and Victor Lowe arrived together. She was dressed for a conclusion. A dark blazer, composed expression, the leather portfolio Victor carried for her under his arm. She walked into the courtroom the way people walked when they believed the outcome had already been settled. And she took her seat at the plaintiff's table and arranged her materials with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already written the next chapter. Isaac and Margaret were already seated at the respondent's table. Sandra looked across the room at Isaac. She nodded, the precise, contained nod of someone communicating a position rather than a greeting. Isaac looked back at her, with nothing in his expression that required a response. The bailiff called the court. Judge Bernard Reese entered and took the bench with the practiced formality of a man who had been doing this for 8 years. He reviewed his case file. He set his glasses down on the bench. "Before this proceeding begins," he said, in the even tone of a man reading from a prepared statement, "I am required under Canon 3E of the Pennsylvania Code of Judicial Conduct to disclose a conflict of interest and to enter a formal recusal notice into the record of this court." Victor Lowe's pen stopped moving on his notepad. Sandra's expression did not change. Not yet. "I am co-founder and co-managing partner of Drummond Reese Community Development Partners, LLC, a limited liability company registered with the Pennsylvania Secretary of State, currently managing $14 million in active community development projects across 6 Philadelphia neighborhoods. The respondent in this matter, Isaac Drummond, is my co-founder, equal partner, and a personal friend of 15 years. Our business relationship is active, ongoing, and fully documented in the company's public registration record." He paused. I am recusing myself from this matter in full, effective immediately. A substitute judge will be assigned within 48 hours. All preliminary motions, including the motion to reclassify respondent's partnership equity as a marital asset, are hereby held in abeyance pending reassignment. He looked up from his statement. I note for the record that any subsequent valuation of the partnership equity at issue in that motion should begin with the company's registered filings, which are publicly available from the Secretary of State's office and which reflect the company's full asset history. He gathered his materials. This court is in recess. No one moved for 3 seconds. Then Victor Lowe turned to Sandra and said something low and very urgent. She was looking at the exhibit in front of her, the valuation Hartwick had prepared, the number that had anchored 8 months of case preparation, the figure that had just been placed, publicly and permanently, in the same court record as the words $14 million. Margaret leaned toward Isaac and said 2 words, very quietly. He nodded once. He did not smile. Victor Lowe rose. Your Honor, before you leave the bench, Judge Reese was already stepping down. The bailiff looked at Victor Lowe with the expression of a man who had seen many attorneys attempt to continue a proceeding that had formally ended. Victor Lowe sat down. The courtroom was quiet and bright. The morning light moved through the tall windows without interest in what it was illuminating. Sandra turned to look at Isaac. Her face had moved through its stages and had arrived somewhere that was neither anger nor regret, but something colder. The specific recognition of a person who has just understood, fully and without remaining ambiguity, that they had spent 8 months building a structure on a foundation they had never actually examined. Isaac stood. He gathered the manila folder from the table, the registered filings, the equity certification, the co-founder documentation, documents he had brought in case they were needed. They had not been needed today. The record had handled itself. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Sandra directly and evenly. 9 years, he said. You never asked. He picked up his briefcase and walked out of the courtroom beside Margaret, through the wide and echoing corridor, and out through the building's front door into the cold and unremarkable Philadelphia morning where the traffic was already moving and the Vine Street sidewalk was full of people going to the next thing. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed an ally to speak for him. The record had spoken. The work had spoken. Everything he had built for 15 years had announced itself in that room clearly and without drama, the way things that are real always announce themselves when the conditions are finally right. 7 months later, the Henderson Street project was 60% through Phase 2. Isaac stood at the mahogany table in the Drummond-Reese conference room at 7 in the morning, going over the framing inspection report with the project architect. The building was coming in ahead of schedule. The historic facade was intact. The 48 units would be ready for occupancy before the winter. The second hearing had been held before a substitute judge 6 weeks after the recusal. Margaret had arrived with 61 pages of documentation and independent equity certification and 15 years of clean records. Victor Lowe's motion to reclassify the partnership equity had been denied. The registered value of Isaac's interest had been established at $2.7 million and ruled a premarital asset that had never been commingled. The 9 months of marital waste transfers, $43,200, had been documented and entered into the recovery order. Sandra had received what was hers by the actual record of the marriage, not what she had expected. What the record showed. Victor Lowe had filed a self-review memorandum with his firm following the hearing, a document that had become the subject of some discussion in Philadelphia family law circles, as Margaret had mentioned without dwelling on it. Philip Hartwick had relocated his brokerage practice to the suburbs. His name had circulated in the Center City development community in a way that did not benefit his client acquisition. Sandra was working at a hospital system in New Jersey. The social circle she had been building in Center City had not followed her across the river. These things happened when the full story got out, and in a city where everyone in a particular industry knew everyone else in that industry, the full story had gotten out. Isaac heard these things through Margaret and registered them without dwelling on them. They were facts. They had their proper place in the record and required no further attention. There was a woman named Alicia in his life now. She was a structural engineer who had come in as a third-party reviewer on the Henderson project 8 months prior, and had spent 2 hours at this same table asking better questions than most people who had been in the field twice as long. She came back for the second meeting because she had thought of more questions. He had invited her to walk the Henderson site. She had arrived with a notebook and looked at the existing structure with the careful attention of someone who understood that what was underneath the visible surface was what actually determined whether a building stood. He had thought about that when he watched her work. He still thought about it. On a November morning, with the Philadelphia light coming through the row house windows at the angle it came through in November, clean and direct and without the warmth it would recover in the spring, Isaac sat at the mahogany table with his coffee and looked at the Henderson framing report and thought about what his mother had told him and what his uncle had confirmed and what 15 years of building, things in a city that needed things built, had taught him about the relationship between the visible and the real. A man's name opens doors before he does. He had spent 15 years building the name right. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.